Hello, my name is Matt Bowker, and I manage Red Scholar's virtual lecture series, and it's my pleasure to host today's virtual lecture. And today, you will be hearing from Leslie Stoltz. Leslie is a naturalist based just outside Yellowstone Park in Montana, and she has worked as a ranger in parks across the western United States, including Yellowstone and Glacier National Park. Let's have a warm virtual welcome for Leslie.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Stoltz, and I have lived and worked in the Greater Yellowstone area for over 40 years, which is hard to imagine at this point. But I'm excited to be here today to share this area with you. And I want to take a minute to thank Red Scholar for the opportunity to do this. But before I begin, I want to share a little secret with you. And that is that when I started working on this program, I told some of my colleagues I was a little bit nervous, and they said, don't worry, just introduce some of your friends to everyone and everything will be just great. So I'm going to introduce you to some of my friends, Mo, Larry, and Curly Joe, who visited Yellowstone in 1970 on a fishing and camping trip. Now, I wasn't really there in 1970, but I thought you might enjoy meeting them anyway. So this is Old Faithful Geyser, and it's the iconic image of Yellowstone National Park. And when you think of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, you want to think of millions of lands surrounding, millions of acres of different land that surrounds Yellowstone, and they fit together like puzzle pieces. And all of these lands together create a functioning ecosystem that land managers and stewards today look at as a large bioregion. And this Greater Yellowstone ecosystem is in fact one of the largest bioregions in the world. Greater Yellowstone consists of both Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks, as well as 2 Indian reservations, 3 national wildlife refuges, 3.5 million acres of private lands, and 5 national forests. In addition to these national forests, there are 10 wilderness areas that are included within these forests. So all told, this is 18 to 20 million acres that are intact, and they support a historic complement of wildlife species that has existed here. Through time, ancient peoples visited Yellowstone, and eventually fur trappers, prospectors, and soon settlement. In 1860s, some of the first official expeditions visited Yellowstone, surveying and mapping, and Ferdinand Hayden, who is the official, he was the director of the U.S. Geologic Survey, visited Yellowstone in the summer of 1871. And with him were about 40 expedition members, including Thomas Moran, who was a guest artist, and William Henry Jackson, who was the official photographer. Images from this expedition were seen by the American people, and it stimulated curiosity about this area that was previously considered a fabrication of some wild imaginations. So December of 1871, a bill proposing a public park around the headwaters of the Yellowstone River was presented to Congress. And the Northern Pacific Railroad saw this as a destination for some of their future wealthy travelers. Ferdinand Hayden considered this a unique volcanic area that would be considered a significant natural laboratory. So March 1st, 1872, the Yellowstone Park Act was passed, and it created this area as the world's first federally managed park, and ultimately the world's first national park. That first year, there were over 500 visitors, and most of them came on rail and then ultimately stagecoach. But they certainly enjoyed the park differently than we do today. Everyone was interested in seeing these geysers. And in Yellowstone Park, there's over 300 geysers, which is actually more than all the geysers put together in the rest of the planet. So most of the geysers in the world are found in Yellowstone Park. Hot springs and mud pots, which are these unique features that form when microbial metabolism, the byproduct of microbial metabolism is hydrogen sulfide gas. And this mixes with surface moisture to form sulfuric acid, which breaks down the native rhyolite rock to form a clay. And the consistency of this clay depends on how much moisture there is at the time. And so it's either really soupy or really goopy. And hydrogen sulfide gases that are escaping from the soupy or goopy mud pots, or the soupy or goopy clay, will determine how these mud pots are showing off, I guess. And the sound of the mud pots is sort of like the Maxwell House commercial, which is doo-doo-doo-doo. They are certainly delightful for all audiophiles. In the northern part of the park, superheated water travels through fractures and fault lines and surfaces through the native limestone with dissolved calcium carbonate. Travertine mineral is deposited in the Mammoth Hot Springs area, forming these exquisite Travertine Terraces. There's some beautiful bands of colors that are living and exist in these runoff channels from some of these hot springs. And at first glance, it looks as though they might be mineral deposits, but in fact, these are biological, and these are colonies of organisms that exist in these extreme environments. This water is superheated. It can almost be boiling temperatures. It can be very high acidity, high alkalinity, full of heavy metals. And scientists have examined these microorganisms to recognize and learned that the proteins in these organisms and the enzymes sometimes can actually metabolize these heavy metals, but certainly they can withstand these extreme environments. And these proteins that don't break down have been used as applications in industrial processes, in medical processes, as well as forensic processes. And so this is another way that Yellowstone's been used as a living laboratory. Over the last 2 million years, there's been 3 supervolcano events in Yellowstone, and this has certainly shaped the landscape. But the remnant heat from these events is the heat source for this superheated water that feeds all the thermal areas in Yellowstone. Geology is really fascinating, but ultimately visitors recognize that the wildlife in this area was fascinating as well. Individuals in this area have learned to coexist with animals for the most part. Charismatic megafauna, which is a really cool, which is a fancy word for really cool big animals like this grizzly bear, roam through this area. And this is significant because grizzly bears and animals like bears need intact habitat and large areas to roam. By the 1960s, the grizzly populations were quite low, and in the 1970s, the grizzly was protected as a threatened species with the Endangered Species Act. So since that time, their population abundance has grown, their range has expanded, and their cub production has increased. So this is a success story for an animal like the grizzly bear. Another animal that's seen frequently in the Greater Yellowstone is the American buffalo, or bison. And their numbers, again, had dropped to a very low number by the early 1900s. The Army, the management practices by the Army, which administered the park at that time, have led to a healthy population of bison throughout the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And it's an animal that one will see when you visit Yellowstone or Grand Tetons. So the gray wolf was reintroduced to Yellowstone in the mid-90s. Wolves, along with other predators, were extirpated throughout the American West by the 1950s, as they were thought to be a threat to ranchers and hunters. For 50 years, there were no wolves in this ecosystem. At this point in time, Greater Yellowstone has, the population of wolves in Greater Yellowstone is over 400 wolves, and within Yellowstone Park itself, it's vacillated around 100 wolves. So this is a success story in the return of the wolf to this area. And this is significant because the presence of the wolf helps balance out the population of other species in this area. And this is a great example of advice that was given by the great ecologist Aldo Leopold, who once said, "The key to intelligent tinkering is to save all the parts." So a species like the American wolf is considered a keystone species in this web of life. Web of life consists of keystone species that impact other animals, as well as cycles and processes that are important for a functioning ecosystem. Another keystone species is the quaking aspen, and abundant population of aspen groves are habitat, food sources, and food sources for for many species of animals, mammals, birds, and insects. One is this mountain bluebird. Another is the beaver. And of course, beavers are builders of dams and lodges, and the ponds that they create help encourage wetlands. And wetlands are significant habitats for songbirds like this yellow warbler, as well as large mammals like this Shiras moose that lives in the Greater Yellowstone. Some of the processes in the area of Greater Yellowstone are significant in shaping this ecosystem. And one of those is wildfires. Wildfires have existed in this area for hundreds of years. And 1988 was one of the recent years when Yellowstone had a huge wildfire regime. That year, there were over 800,000 acres that burned, and that's 40% of the park. So this gave fire ecologists an opportunity to go in and take a look at the results of these natural wildfires. Ultimately, fire ecologists recognized that there were benefits and consequences from wildfires. Some of the benefits were the returning of nutrients to the soils that resulted in just explosions of grasses and other vegetation that was really important for grazing animals in Yellowstone. It also resulted in getting rid of dead and diseased trees and some insect pests that were significant in the dying forests that had been occurring in Yellowstone. So ultimately, fire ecologists recognized that wildfire was more beneficial to these wildlands than it was detrimental. Another cycle that's really significant in Yellowstone is the watershed, or the water cycle. And because Yellowstone and the whole Yellowstone ecosystem is basically a high plateau that's surrounded by high mountains, most of our water is gotten from snowpack. And if you look at a map of these watersheds, you'll see that this is the headwaters for 3 significant river systems in the area. One is the Green River, which starts in the Wind River mountain range in the southeastern part of Greater Yellowstone in the Wind Rivers. And it flows about 700 miles down to the Colorado River. On the in the southwest corner of Yellowstone, on the west side of the Continental Divide, the Snake River has its headwaters, and it flows almost 1,000 miles before it joins the Columbia River and eventually flows into the Pacific Ocean. And the Missouri River on the east side of Yellowstone Park has its headwaters. It flows all the way out over 2,000 miles to where it joins the Mississippi River and eventually into the Gulf of Mexico. I mentioned that almost all the moisture in Yellowstone comes to us in the form of snow. And as spring arrives, it's visible, it's obvious how much snow we really get, how much really falls in this area. Even though our winters are much shorter than they've been, probably a month shorter, we'll still have as many feet of snow on the ground. And I want to encourage everyone to consider, just a little sideline, visiting Yellowstone in the winter, because it's a unique experience like nothing you've had before. So water in Yellowstone is really significant in shaping the landscape. And in the Greater Yellowstone area, there's hundreds of waterfalls. And flowing water has been significant in shaping many different features around the region, like this Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. And far upstream at the head of the Grand Canyon, you can see the lower falls of the Yellowstone that drops over 300 feet. So I've talked a lot about water. I oftentimes really focus on the significance of the Greater Yellowstone area as a huge headwaters area for fresh, clean water. And we all know that all life forms need water to exist, just like we do. So I want to go ahead and finish this up by asking the question, why do we need bioregions? Why do we need places like the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and functioning ecosystems? And one of the reasons that we need areas like this is to fill up our spirits and the souls so as we connect with nature. Another reason is for functioning ecosystems and large bioregions that provide an opportunity to see bear tracks in the snow as they come out of hibernation in the spring. And one last reason is so that we can ensure the longevity of these last great wild places. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Leslie. So as expected, we have a lot of questions. And some of the first questions that we have, several people have asked, is it possible to bathe in the Travertine Terraces? Now, I don't know what a Travertine Terrace is. Could you explain what a Travertine Terrace is? And also, can you bathe, and have you ever bathed in a Travertine Terrace?
Well, I showed a quick image of the Travertine Terraces in the northern part of the park, and they are exquisite staircase structures that form as this dissolved calcium carbonate is redeposited on the surface as the water cools, and it just forms this terraced stair-step formation that are full of pools of hot water. It is not legal. It's not permitted to bathe in these Travertine Terraces now. However, historically, there were a couple of locations in the Mammoth Terraces where visitors and employees did bathe. That was long before my time, but there is an area just north of Mammoth Hot Springs where the Travertine is located. And that's where the runoff from the Travertine Terraces flows into the Gardner River. And that region is called the Boiling River. And so you've got really superheated water flowing into the colder Gardner River. And that creates a little natural jacuzzi kind of environment where people are permitted to bathe certain times of the year.
Great. So Deborah would like to know, what is the greatest challenge facing Yellowstone, in your opinion?
The greatest challenge facing Yellowstone is balancing all the management issues and ensuring that the long-term, I'm going to say the long-term balance of all the different systems is intact. I think the second greatest challenge to Greater Yellowstone is settlement and development around the park and sort of impinging populations around Yellowstone.
Okay. So Joanne wants to just mention that she and her granddaughter loved the Rhodes Scholar program and their trip with you. And she wants to know, how is the Lamar Wolf Pack doing this year?
Well, there's actually 3 different wolf packs that are traveling in and out of Lamar. And the Lamar Canyon pack and the Junction pack and the Junction Butte pack are doing well. You know, Yellowstone Park has been closed for at least 3 weeks now. And so we don't have quite as much information about the wolf packs in that area as we typically would. I do know that one of the other packs, which is called the Wapiti pack, is thriving. And in fact, I saw them several times this winter in various areas around the park. So I think the wolf population is doing well right now. The pups have been born, but in fact, the pups are probably just very recently born. And so there hasn't been a pup count up to this point in time, but there will be by later in the summer. So I would say wolves are doing well at this point in time.
Good. So a few people have asked about the supervolcano under Yellowstone, and has there been any rumblings in the press about any rumblings under Yellowstone?
Well, that's always a concern when people visit Yellowstone, for sure. When is it going to blow? When is Yellowstone going to blow? And in watching volcanic activity, the U.S. Geologic Survey certainly has monitoring stations throughout the park. And they're constantly, every day, there's real-time data that's measuring seismic activity, surface deformation, and gases that are escaping at the surface. So these are all indicators of a potential large eruption. And what these scientists say is, in the event that there would be a future big eruption of Yellowstone Park or anywhere around Yellowstone, all of these monitoring efforts would give us lots of warning about a potential eruption. So I can very confidently say none of these events seem to be, there's nothing that's pointing to one of these events in the near future.
Okay, good. So how can you tell, this question is from Alice, and Alice would like to know, how can you tell the different wolf packs?
Each wolf pack, there's 10 or 11 wolf packs in the park right now. And most of the wolf packs have an alpha female and an alpha male that are collared. The exception to that is the Wapiti pack, who has an alpha female who's very light in color, and she's referred to as a white wolf. So other members of the packs are collared. Each wolf, each individual wolf with a collar is constantly transmitting a unique signal. And so scientists that are following these wolves can identify the wolf packs in part by the signals that they're picking up. Another indication is there's lots of different features that stand out in different wolf packs. I mentioned the Wapiti pack has a very light colored female. Each wolf pack has a specific number of members. You know, this is constantly shifting, but there's people that are always watching these wolf packs in the Lamar Valley, as Joanne asked that question. There's 3 different wolf packs, and when the park is open, there are people out in the Lamar Valley at daybreak watching wolves out there all day long. And people are communicating back and forth with each other, reporting what the activities of each wolf pack seem to be doing. And many of those people can recognize every individual in those packs just by their markings.
Wow, I had no idea. Several people have asked, and I'm sure this is a question that you've gotten before from other people, but after being closed for so long during this pandemic, will visiting Yellowstone right after it opens be a unique experience in your view? That's from Karen.
Yeah, well, I think in some ways, yes, it will be a unique experience, because when Yellowstone reopens, it won't just open the floodgates and all services will be open. So it will have a soft reopening, and when the gates are open, there'll be limited services available, and all of that whole process of getting the park up and operating will be a process. So I think it's likely that there could be, fewer visitors in the park for the early part of the season, at least.
And to go along with that, how do you think, David wants to know, how are the animals, in your opinion, how are they reacting to the lack of visitors now?
Well, I don't know, because I haven't been there, but I do think that it's not unlike seasonal closures. So between winter and summer season, there's a month to a month and a half of time when most of the park is closed to visitors, and the same between summer and winter seasons. So during that time, I think that animals become much more accustomed to the road, although you will see animals in the road even during the highlights of the high points of the summer and the winter. But it doesn't take very long. So animals will definitely become more relaxed, if you want to use that term, but it doesn't take long for those animals to recognize, oh, the visitors are back, and they'll return to their more typical behavior in a very short period of time. They have come to understand these waxing and waning of visitors.
Sure. Mike would like to know, you talked about this a little bit, about the keystone species. What makes the wolves a keystone species, and could you talk about what the definition of a keystone species is?
Well, a keystone species, I'm going to start with that first. A keystone species is any kind of organism, mammal, I mentioned that quaking aspen, something that's presence in an ecosystem, and that's balanced presence will impact many other species and many other processes. So when one thinks about the gray wolf back in Yellowstone Park, for 50 years the wolf was missing in Yellowstone. So without the top predator in Yellowstone, many populations grew explosively. In fact, one example of that is the elk population in Yellowstone was considered too high, and by many, not everyone agrees with that, but many people considered that the numbers of elk were too high for the ecosystem to sustain their food needs. And so a lot of the area was becoming overgrazed and negatively impacted by those high populations of elk. The other thing that happened was there was a different balance of coyotes and fox. So without the wolves, the coyotes moved in and they were taking on the niche of the wolf. And so coyotes, which typically are either really in small family groups or maybe even individual, they started to form packs and have similar kinds of behaviors as wolves. So that changed the behaviors of those types of animals. When the wolves came back, there was a shifting of the balance shifted between all of these kinds of species, and numbers of elk dropped, although wolves weren't the only impact on the population of elk. Coyotes scattered. Some people look at the introduction of the wolf and the decline of the numbers of elk as having some positive impacts on the range in Yellowstone. So different kinds of vegetation were returning to the area. But there's lots of pieces of this puzzle, and it's a big story. But that's just a small example of a keystone species like the wolf impacting the balance of many other species.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned that you haven't been to the park, but you are right outside the park, correct?
I am. I'm right outside the park boundary. So I'm kind of a stone's throw from the park boundary right now, yes. So surrounding Greater Yellowstone are many communities, and there's 5 gateways into Yellowstone. On the west side of the park, the gateway is the town of West Yellowstone, and north of West Yellowstone, of maybe 50 miles north, is the town of Big Sky, and that's where I call home. But there's a road that's US 191. It's a federal highway that travels through the Gallatin Valley down through West Yellowstone, and along that road there's several ranches, guest ranches, and private homes. And right at this point in time, I am staying a little bit closer to the border of the park right now.
So you mentioned the winter being your favorite time to visit. We have several questions from many people about why is it your favorite time to visit?
Well, I'm kind of a cold weather girl, although I love summer. I love every season in the park. I am particularly fond of winter because I love cross-country skiing. The snowpack and the impacts of cold temperatures, air temperatures on the snow, create a whole suite of phenomenal snow crystals, different kinds of formations. The forest turns into just a very quiet kind of experience skiing through the trees. I just really love, I think, the quiet of winter. Things slow down a little bit in winter, but I really do love cross-country skiing.
Okay. Outside of the wolf, are there any other keystone species that could be reintroduced? This is questions from Debbie.
That could be reintroduced. I would say at this point in time, and I mentioned this, that within the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, we really do have a complete suite of species that existed here historically. There has been a decline in some populations. I'm going to tell a quick story of the cutthroat trout, which is a native fish in Yellowstone Lake, which is a keystone species, in that many other species depend on the cutthroat trout as a food source. Sometime in the 1980s, lake trout were mysteriously introduced into Yellowstone Lake, and they are a large cutthroat eating fish that lives in the depths of the lake, and they spawn in gravel bars on the bottom of the lake. So as the numbers of cutthroat, or as the numbers of lake trout grew, the numbers of cutthroat declined. And cutthroat populations dropped to pretty critical low numbers. So all these animals and birds that depend on cutthroat trout, and that includes 42 species of mammals and birds, they were left without a food source that they'd become accustomed to. So at this point in time, the Park Service has an effort, for the last decade, there's been a significant effort using gill nets to try and remove lake trout from Yellowstone Lake, and it's showing some very positive results.
This should be an easy question for you to answer. This question is from Karen. If you had the power to implement any policy change that you could in Yellowstone, what is the first issue that you would attack?
That's a big question. I am, personally, I think that I have worked in resource management and guided and taught in Yellowstone and recreated and enjoyed Yellowstone for so many years. And I have seen such a growth in interest and visitation in Yellowstone. And I personally feel as though there needs to be some management, of visitation in Yellowstone. And I'm not suggesting that we need to lower the numbers of people, but maybe change the way people travel through specific areas of the park. And I think changing some of these travel patterns may ultimately have less, it will change visitation to have less impacts on the park, because after a busy summer in the park is really tired, and there's been a lot of impacts, resource damage.
This question is, we have lots of people asking this question, but do you have a favorite geyser?
Well, there's lots of really neat geysers, and if I had to pick one favorite geyser, remember the photo I showed of Great Fountain Geyser? That might be my favorite geyser.
Several people are just very happy that you are suggesting to go in winter, and they're going to take your recommendation. Here's a question from Lynn. How many pups a year would a wolf produce, and how often do they produce?
Wolves typically have they'll have one litter a year. The alpha female is typically the female who bears the pups. An average number of pups in a litter might be between 4 and 8. They're born in the den, and all of the adults help feed the pups. All the adults will gather food and bring it back to the female. And if she has a need to get out and stretch her wolf legs, then someone will stay with the pups for a little while. But it's an annual cycle. Their breeding time is February, and so it's about 6 weeks before she has her pups in the den, and the pups have the entire year to learn how to be big pups and big wolves.
So we have time for just a few more questions. This one is from Michael. Michael says, from his limited knowledge of volcanoes, it seems that lava and ash are the matter that is commonly emitted by volcanoes. Is Yellowstone a unique volcano in that it emits heated water and whatever other liquids contained in geysers?
I would say it's not necessarily a unique volcano. So there are other areas similar to Yellowstone. In a nutshell, the unique factor in Yellowstone is that this volcano is fueled not at a plate boundary, but as a result of a hot spot, which is a plume of lava that's escaped from the mantle. In the supervolcano events, there was lots of ash and lots of lava that surfaced in the actual volcanic event. The surface collapsed to create a big cauldron or caldera, and eventually lava poured out of this caldera and filled the cauldron. So we have this high plateau today. It's a little bit of a, maybe too long of a story to talk about the workings of the plumbing system for Yellowstone, but the rock is heated by the magma and the water is heated by the hot rock. And so the heat source for all of this is still from the volcanic activity below Yellowstone.
Great. And the last question, and I'm going to ask this question since I know that you will be talking about this at your next webinar, but could you tell us a little bit about your background with the grizzly bear study?
Yeah, so when I left Yellowstone Park, I went up to Glacier National Park, and I worked up there both in education and in research. And Kate Kendall was the research biologist up in that area, and she was doing a long-term population study monitoring bear populations and their trends versus specific numbers. So I was a field biologist, and I was working in part on a food habit study, collecting data out in the field, but there was a lot of diversity with my field work, and most of the work I did was in the field, but there was a small percentage that was in the office with some of the other biologists. And I'll talk a little bit about that more in the program that I do about bears.
Well, great. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you very much.
Thanks again so much. Bye, everyone.